Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Dvar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 2, Halacha 2. This will be a two-part shiur in the Art Scroll on 22b1. And today we're going to get into what about separating truma for different species of produce individually. So the Mishnah starts off and it said that one may not separate truma from one species of produce on behalf of another species of produce. In other words, you can't do wine on behalf of grain, and this is not only to truma but also to all tithes. So you have to do like by like. Now that's really what we're going to be getting into, because what's going to constitute like by like, or like an example of that? What about like wheat that's going to be brown wheat, and what about wheat that's going to be, say, semolina wheat or white wheat? Well, is that going to count as the same species? That can be like by like, or is that going to be a little bit different? What about a dried fig for a ripe fig, one that hasn't been dried yet? Is that going to be like by like? That's what we're getting into. So the Mishnah continues, and it says, if one did separate truma from one species on behalf of another species, his truma is not truma. In other words, it never got truma sanctity, and the tevel produce from which he took it from did not become permitted for use. In other words, he did not fix it. So again, taking wine for grain, when you separate it out, you say a bracha. First of all, it's bracha levatala, very serious. And second of all, it's still going to be tevel. You didn't actually fix anything. So the next part of the Mishnah says that there's going to be examples of food that are going to be deemed to be a single species with regard to separating truma. And it says that all varieties of wheat are considered to be one species with regard to truma. So you do have different varieties of wheat. For instance, you have white wheat and red wheat. I think red wheat tends to be harder, and one will grow like a winter wheat, and one will be like a summer wheat. And it's basically saying that all the varieties, because there are a lot of varieties, are going to be considered one. And this gets into like a kalayim issue, where the chapter 1, halacha 1, lists different things that are connected with each other for kalayim, where they're really, even if they look a little bit different, it's still regarded as one species. Then it says all varieties of fresh figs, dried figs, and pressed figs are considered one species with regard to truma. Now, why are we dealing with fresh figs? Well, you have bunoas shuach. These are figs that are white, that ripen over a 3-year cycle. And then you have black figs, which will ripen in a 1-year cycle. And are they going to be considered the same species, even though one is ripening 3 years later? The answer is yes, they are. But they're while they're the same variety, they have a different characteristic to it. First of all, they're not going to be colliding with one another. And second of all, you could tithe, say, white figs for black figs. Then you have dried figs in here. Why are we talking about dried figs? Well, we're going to get into that, because what about if you're tithing on behalf of dried figs for fresh figs? Is that going to count, even if they're, say, the same variety, black figs and black figs, right? And then pressed figs, these are going to be where they're processed. Now, the way it works is you take them and you press them into a barrel, and they will cake together with the juice and stick together with the juice. So certainly not a truma issue or a tomato tahor issue, because it's fruit juice. And then they dry out and they preserve. So you have the pressed figs, which are now processed into these cakes. And the idea is they're considered one species with regard to truma, and it says that one may therefore separate truma from any one of these on behalf of the other. So in other words, you can even separate truma for white figs on behalf of black figs, or vice versa, and you could also separate tithes from fresh and dried or pressed figs on behalf of, say, the other one, so fresh figs for pressed figs, or pressed figs for dried figs which haven't been processed yet, or fresh figs. And the idea is going to be that fresh figs are going to be better quality than dried figs, and dried figs are going to be, they're not going to spoil. But the question is that going to be coming up later on is, well, you have to tithe from the best. So what if there's a cone there? Can you give him dried figs when you have fresh figs right there? That's going to be an issue. But anyway, the Mishnah nonetheless says that one may separate truma from any one of these on behalf of any of the other. So again, what's interesting is that you can learn from this the three things, right? There's fresh figs, which are going to be higher quality. Then you have pressed figs, which are going to be processed, and then dried figs. So each one is a little bit different, and it's trying to have all three examples to teach you something about specificity in here. Anyway, the Mishnah is going to talk about determining which produce should be given precedence when designating truma. And by the way, in the background, you can hear in the kollel at Dvar Yerushalayim, which is has a brisk kollel here, that you can hear that people are learning in the background. It's early morning, it's after davening, and the people are learning. So the Mishnah says, wherever there is a kohen available to receive the truma without delay, one should separate truma from the superior produce, even if it's more likely to spoil. So the Rosh is saying that in the case of somebody who separates truma from fresh and dried figs together, that this would mean that somebody designates the fresh figs as truma, since the fresh figs are superior to dried figs, and that's what you should give. You should, because it's a Torah verse, right? You should be giving the superior produce, and then the idea is that the fresh ones are superior to the dried ones. And the source for this, from the choice, this comes from the verse in Numbers 18:29, that's talking about truma, and it's actually saying that it's to separate from the best. But when we look at the halacha lamaisa, this requirement is not essential to the truma's validity. So in other words, if you still took from say the dried figs and you gave it, dried figs are not as good as fresh figs. Should you do it from the fresh figs? Yes. But if you gave from the dried figs, did you still designate it as truma? Yes. Did the bracha hold? Yes. Is the pile of figs that you have there tevel? No. You can use it. So you gave from the second best, but it's still going to be truma. So the next part of the Mishnah says that wherever there is no kohen available to receive the truma, one should separate truma from that which will keep, even if it's lesser quality. So again, you can see that we do have a difference between dried figs and fresh figs and pressed figs. And the Mishnah is basically says the Rambam, when he's talking about it in his commentary in this Mishnah, he's saying that even in the absence of a kohen, the requirement to separate truma from long-lasting dried figs applies only in a place where there's a skill in drying figs, and where the people are skilled in the craft. One separates figs, even if there's no kohen to fulfill the requirement of separating superior produce, and he's drying them so they'll be preserved until a kohen can be located. And the commentary by the Rambam is also saying that the Mishnah is reasoning that where there's no kohen readily available to receive the truma, one should separate dried figs as truma because they might spoil before the kohen can be found. And although the dried figs are objectively not superior, they're deemed superior with regards to the absence of a kohen, since they're going to keep longer, and therefore they're more valuable to the kohen. Now, there's a dissenting view. Rabbi Yudah says that one must always separate truma from the superior produce, even if it's likely to spoil and there's no kohen at hand. And so the Rosh is saying about this that Rabbi Yudah does not accept the argument that what is best for the kohen in the circumstance is deemed to be the superior produce, and Rabbi Yudah is saying that you actually have to be objective when you're looking at what is superior produce. So even if there's no kohen and the produce might not keep, you don't need to worry about the kohen's potential loss. So the Rosh is writing that in his commentary in the Mishnah, which is excellent, by the way, that after designating the fresh figs as truma, the owner should not simply allow them to spoil if there's no kohen available, and he should actually have them dried at the kohen's expense. In other words, if it costs money, he should deduct that and charge him for it. There's this dissenting view, and the Mishnah is illustrating the dispute with an example on onions of different sizes. It says where there's no kohen available immediately, one separates as truma a whole small onion that does not spoil quickly, not half of a large onion, which is superior, but it's going to spoil before a cone can reach it. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, rather we're going to separate half of the large onion. So the large onion is going to be considered tastier than the small onion. And because it's tastier, it's deemed to be superior. But a cut onion doesn't last very long. So the Tanakama is saying that if you don't have a cone, you take the produce that's going to last longer over that which is going to be superior. Why? Because like what the Rambam's saying, the Rambam's pointing out that what's superior in this case? It's superior to give it to the cone. So therefore, give him, since he's not available, give him the thing that's going to last longer. That's going to be considered superior. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, objectively speaking, the bigger onion is a tastier onion. That's going to be better. And Rabbi Yehuda says Amara Fulda is going to be saying that the truma must always be separated from objectively superior produce, even if it might spoil before the cone comes to eat it. Now, there's another illustration of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The Mishnah says, and so Rabbi Yehuda would say, one who ties different types of onions separates onions of city dwellers as truma on behalf of those of villagers, even though the latter are less likely to spoil. But we may not separate truma from onions on villagers on behalf of city dwellers, because the latter are the fare of nobility. In other words, since they're better quality, they're going to be taken as truma, notwithstanding their greater susceptibility to spoilage. So all three which are cited are here. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda is going to be saying that in the absence of a cone, superior produce is chosen above what will keep. Because again, Rabbi Yehuda is reading this verse in the Torah in Numbers literally and actually saying that, look, it has to come from the best superior produce. And this is going to be regarded as superior produce objectively. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the different species that may not be separated as truma from one another, and the Gemara is going to give a source for that ruling. And Rabbi Yochanan says, in the name of Rabbi Yanai, that this is one of the three scriptural expositions regarding tithes that are clear in the Torah. In other words, there's a verse describing truma like this, and all three of these are going to be described in this Gemara, and it says, all of the best of oil and all of the best of wine and grain. That's in Numbers 18:12. Now, the idea here is that the best is referring to truma, that somebody's going to separate from produce. And the Torah is going to repeat the term best each time with regard to another type of produce. And that's going to try to teach each species separately. So the tithes may not be separated from one of these species on behalf of the other. And the verse is coming to include both wine and grain as a single mention of best. And so the Rabbeinu Gershom is basically going to be pointing out that the verse makes separate mention of the best regarding each type of food, which implies that tithes may not be taken from one type of food from another. And although the verse is speaking of truma, the laws of truma and meiser are analogous, so meiser also may not be taken from one species on food on behalf, and in fact, for all of the tithes, you can't take from one species on behalf of the other. And the verse in Numbers 18:12 is talking about Hashem granting truma to the Kohanim, and it's describing truma as chelev, which is the best. And the source for this phrase is talking about truma, and it's going to be talking about truma's meiser. And in other words, Rashi in Bavli Berachot 53b is going to be saying about this that this is going to be referring to truma. So yes, it's talking about oil. Yes, it's talking about wine. Yes, it's talking about grain. But you shouldn't read it as specifically those three. You should read it as separating from truma, as like an example. So the Gemara says that what we established to be the verse's intention, including both wine and grain in a single mention of tithes, and the verse basically says what Marafulda is saying is that the verse makes separate mentions of the best with regard to oil and combines wine and grain under a single mention of best. And the Gemara is going to wonder, what does this mean? In other words, why do they used the best twice, but they combined two of the items? Why did they just say the best three times? Why didn't they just put all three and say the best once? Why is it going to be designated like this, best and best? where it's split up like this? That's what it's asking. So the Gemara says, if it comes to teach that one may separate truma from wine on behalf of grain, and from grain on behalf of wine, we will be asking the following. It says, behold, wine and grain are the products of two species of tree, and therefore they're similar. And yet, we may not separate truma or meiser from one on behalf of the other. So, in other words, what this comes to teach is that we may not separate from two tithes, from two different species, from totally unrelated species, like something from wine and grapes, and wine and grain on behalf of the other. So, in other words, if you had just put the oil and the wine together, you would have said, "Oh, you can tithe, oil for wine, no problem." And by putting grapes and grain together, which are dissimilar, basically what you're saying is oh, you can't separate this on behalf of that. And the Gemara says, rather, this is what the verse is saying. Just as in the case of wine and oil, which are similar in that they're both products of trees, one may still not separate truma or meiser from one on behalf of the other, since they're different species. And the other thing is that it says in the Gemara, it says, so too I include of the stricture two species of grain, wheat and barley, or any other species of produce, beans and lentils, to teach that despite their similarities, one may not separate truma and meiser from behalf of one versus the other. In other words, can you separate barley on behalf of wheat? No. Now let me read this verse again in Numbers 18:12. It's saying, when you have separated its best as truma from it, and it's going to be now talking about the best of oil and the best of wine and grain. And so what this coming to teach, it's saying that what are two species that are very similar? Well, oil, which comes from the olive tree, and wine, which comes from the grapevine, also deemed to be a tree in Halacha. And so you might have got confused and said that these two are going to be similar. You can tithe one on behalf of the other. But by splitting them up, what it's doing by putting grain and wine together is it's trying to show that you can't separate any individual species on behalf of a different species, no matter what it is, even grain. So can you separate lentils on behalf of wheat? No, you can't. And this is coming to teach that despite similarities, one may not separate truma or meiser from one on behalf of the other. And the reason that this verse is combining, says the Pnei Moshe, it's combining wine and grain, is not to teach that they may be taken as ties from each other, but to teach an analogy between them. Just as the law of grain is like that of wine, and just as wine may not be taken as truma for oil, even though both are products of a tree, since they're different species, so too different types of grain may not be taken as truma for different types of grain. And this is teaching as a binyan av. In other words, this prototypical teaching for all sorts of produce, and is telling us that no food may be separated as a tithe for another unless they're of the same species. And by the way, the binyan av is one of the 13 methods that's a halacha Moshe Sinai. And basically what it's saying is that when the Torah reveals law in one instance, it can be applied to other similar cases as well. That's a very clever proof. Because again, by separating it out where oil is mentioned separately as the best, and then wine and grain is put together and then saying the best between those two, if you put oil and wine together, you might have said, oh, you can separate this on behalf of that, but because this and this are split up, even though they're both from a tree and they're similar, you can see that they don't. That means that you don't separate this from that, and also, grain is not like oil, and because grain is not like oil, you can't separate on different species of grain as well, even if you have them available in front of you. Now, the next part of the Mishnah, it says all varieties of wheat are considered one species with regard to truma, and the Gemara wonders why Mishnah is going to state something that's really very obvious. And the Gemara says it is needed for this reason. It's to teach that we may separate truma even from white wheat on behalf of red wheat, or from red wheat on behalf of white wheat. So in other words, different color wheat, you might think, oh, well, it's a different species, it's like a different plant. And it's coming to tell you, no, it's not. Now, it's also going to be true of kalayim as well. Can you plant white wheat next to a field of red wheat? Is it going to be kalayim with one another? No, it's going to be considered the same species. Now, the next part of the Mishnah said that all varieties of fresh figs, dried figs, and pressed figs are considered to be one species with regard to truma, and one may therefore separate truma from any one of these on behalf of the other. And the Gemara is going to explain how figs must be measured when tithing from one type on behalf of the other. And it's taught in the Brisa. It says that we separate fresh figs as truma on behalf of dried figs by number, and dried figs as truma on behalf of fresh figs by volume. And it says, but we do not separate fresh figs on behalf of dried figs by volume, nor dried figs on behalf of fresh figs by number. Now, these rules are there to make sure that the different sizes between a fresh fig and a dried fig don't result in a loss for the Kohen. That's the idea, so that when tithes are separated by number, somebody's going to calculate the tithes when counting individual units of produce, and then you take out a percentage. So, for instance, if you're going to separate out from 100 figs, you're going to separate out 2 figs. These rules are here to make sure that the different sizes between the fresh figs and the dried ones don't come up with a net loss to the Kohen. So, over here, when the tithes are separated by number, somebody's going to calculate the tithes by counting out individual units of produce, take out a percentage. For instance, if you're taking out 100 from 100 figs, you're going to take out 2, and then when you're going to be separated by volume, you're going to actually weigh it. So, for instance, if you had a pile of 10 cobs, then if you had a pile of 10 cobs and you wanted to take out, say, 10%, then you would take out 1 cob, and so that's going to be by measurement. So there's a dissent. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that baskets of fresh figs and baskets of dried figs are considered to be one species with regards to truma, and one may therefore separate truma and maestros from one on behalf of the other. So in his view, tithes are always reckoned by volume, regardless of any potential loss for the Kohen. So by talking about baskets of fresh or dried figs that are separated, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that you're always going to do by volume. So this is a dispute to the Tanna Kamma's ruling, which is that fresh figs are separated on behalf of dried figs by number. And there's another dissent that Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, says that his father, Rabbi Yossi, would take 10 dried figs from the drying place as truma on behalf of 90 fresh figs in the basket, and notwithstanding, the dried figs are smaller than the fresh figs. So Rabbi Yishmael is saying that his father, Rabbi Yossi, was doing something a little bit different than what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying this, and this, in other words, fresh, dried, or pressed, in other words, processed, figs, are all going to be considered the same. So as long as you're separating out by volume, did you have any net loss for the Kohen? No. He's getting the same volume of figs, and these figs are like that figs. That's what he's saying. Now, Rabbi Yossi is coming and doing something a little bit different. He's saying that he took out 10 dried figs by number, by count, not by weight, and separated it out from the on behalf of the dried of the fresh figs. And so, what he's giving the Kohen, the 10 dried figs, first of all, are lower quality, but also is smaller. The volume is smaller. And so Rabbi Yossi separating the dried figs, says the Mara Fulda, from fresh ones by number, even though the smaller size seems to be a result in less than the full measure in terms of volume. And this clearly is a dispute with the Tanna Kamma's second ruling, which is that dried figs are separated from fresh figs by volume. And so what's going to be Rabbi Yossi's reasoning? So the Gemara is going to cite a dispute regarding the reasoning that underlies the practice of Rabbi Yossi. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yirmiyah thought to say that according to Rabbi Yossi, one views the shrunken figs as though if it was swollen to its full size. And for this reason, Rabbi Yossi is not worried that the dried figs that are smaller in size than the fresh figs. So Rabbi Yossi took for himself baskets of fresh figs whose volume were deemed to be the same size as the dried figs, separating as tithes. In other words, the way to explain this is that Rabbi Yossi saying that there are two states. You have a swollen one, which is fresh, and you have a shrunken one. But they're always deemed, regarding matters of halacha, to be the larger size. So even if it's currently in the shrunken state, you're going to look at what it was before it shriveled. Now, somebody who's going to separate dried figs from fresh ones is going to be considered, according to Rabbi Yossi, to be separating objects of equal size. So Rabbi Yossi, by taking out 10 dried figs, is truma meiser on behalf of 90 fresh ones. He's actually tithing according to volume. So actually what he's saying that, this was plump. We go by when it was plump and swollen. And even though that it shriveled and now it's going to be lower in terms of halacha, we always regard it as the bigger size. Now, in tomorrow's shiur, we're going to get into other cases of things that were once a certain size and then it shrunk. And it's actually interesting because this comes up in laws of taharos. What if you had a small piece of corpse and the corpse was going to be, say, the volume of the barley corn, and then, or a little bit bigger, and then it shrunk to less than that? Well, if you look at it the present state and it's going to be smaller than that, is something going to be tameh? Or are you going to look at it from the original state before it shrunk and say it's tameh because it was originally that way? Now that's really what Rabbi Yossi, the father of Rabbi Yishmael, is doing. He's saying that you're in the halacha, you're looking at the original state of what it was before it dried out, and that's how you're measuring it from there. And so he's saying, al pi halacha and al pi din, basically on the halacha and in terms of actually what's going on with calculating it, he separated it by volume, and he separated this from this, and it's fair. And he gave him something that was the same. So we're going to dig more into that in tomorrow's shiur. Have a great day.